Hi, everybody. I just wanted to go over 3-act structure with you very briefly. Um, all this information is in the lessons. If you learn better from reading, then you can just read and skip the video. But some people do learn better from watching a video. So I thought this was an important enough lesson that I'd stop and take a few moments and discuss it with you and tell you verbally how it goes. Basically, 3-act structure is Act 1 is the beginning, Act 2 is the middle, and Act 3 is the end. When people refer to 3-act structure, they're talking about making sure that a script is written hitting certain landmarks within certain parameters of the beginning, middle, and end. When you open a script, this is considered stage 1 of the story. It's before a major incident happens. Stage 1 is centered on an event to open the film that will establish the ordinary life and the character flaw of the protagonist. The ordinary life of the protagonist is kind of setting up the world and establishing things. You shouldn't be spending time establishing things that are boring, or if the world is boring, then what's important is that there's conflict still within that boring life for the protagonist. Nobody wants to watch a scene setting up humdrum stuff. Even in the humdrum, there has to be some conflict. And during that time, you establish the personality flaw of your central character. Most people who want to really set themselves apart as a writer will have a moment by the end of the film where the character will have changed and that personality flaw will be righted or wronged even further depending on how the events have affected them during the story. So it's important right away that you establish the tone, the genre of the film, that you set up the ordinary life, what he's like before he changes or she changes, depending on what your protagonist is, and then and that you've decided how that will play into the story. You will reach turning point 1 roughly 10% of the way into the story. This is an unexpected thing that happens to the protagonist, throwing off the natural course of everyday events you've established in the first moment. So turning point 1 is also called the inciting incident. It is the proverbial, quote, call to adventure. It occurs before the middle of Act 1. So this should be something that happens which nudges the protagonist out of his or her comfort zone. This is the catalyst moment that answers the question, why is this protagonist going to consider doing something out of their ordinary, out of what they deem as what their normal structure is? Because you had to establish the normal structure before, at the end of Act 1, you show that a character is going to step out of that normal structure at the end of Act 1. What to do now and how the protagonist responds to this moment should not be a very easy decision for the protagonist. It challenges them. It usually plays into their character flaw or is inspired by something that happens because of their character flaw. Interesting stories are firmly about shoving characters outside their comfort zone. This will lead you to, roughly by a quarter of the way into the script, you will reach what's called turning point 2. It's also called plot point 1. It's the end of Act 1 or the climax of Act 1. It is when the protagonist makes a tough decision. They should make a decision at the end of Act 1 to do something about what they experienced in turning point 1. So, one quarter of the way into your story, the protagonist has to make a choice that will change their life irrevocably forever. That choice must be dynamic enough to make this character worthy of the role of protagonist. You don't want boring characters, you want them to be bold. It's best when this decision somehow ties directly to the character flaw. It usually epitomizes it, but it can be the protagonist's first small step into learning to grow out of their flaw. It needs to be a decision that has profound effects on the character and begins his or her journey to facing and overcoming that character flaw that they had at the beginning of the story and have probably had most of their lives. This starts the character arc of the inner journey versus the outer journey. The physical outer journey is what they're doing outside, and that's what these turning points mainly are. And the inner journey is how the character is changing. It's the character arc. So this kind of really kicks everything in the story into motion. Both the outer journey starts to happen because they make a decision to do something that will change their life, but on the inside, this is also a choice that's going to change who they are fundamentally over the course of the small or large story. Um, a change of plans, a crossing of the threshold. This is the leaving of their ordinary world and to enter a new and unexpected or special world. That sends you into Act Two. This is the heart of the movie. The whole middle half, over half the movie, should be Act Two. This is the middle. This is the guts. This is the hardest part. It's considered, uh, if you take the biblical story of the Jews leaving Egypt, this would be the 40 years in the desert. You know, though the text spends a lot of time on the choice and how they leave Egypt, a lot of the story is spent in that desert wandering for 40 years and what they learn in that story so that at the end they come out on the other side. So that's Act Two. Act Two is the desert between your two major destinations that will challenge the protagonist. So Turning Point Three is at the very middle of your story. It is also called the midpoint. It is the major escalation in stakes, where it becomes clear how much this can cost the protagonist, more than they ever knew before making the decision at the end of Act One. So at the middle, it's basically a huge uh-oh. It's called the ordeal. It's called the belly of the beast. Uh, uh, it's it makes them realize that they're heading toward what will be turning point four, which is when they have to face their greatest fears, which become reality. Uh, this the protagonist tastes death or loss at this moment in the middle of the story. They have to, something has to happen that makes them realize exactly how much they stand to lose, because if they don't realize how much they stand to lose, then they're not going to really be facing their fears. They're not going to have to be heroic to finish their journey. So there has to be a moment when people decide to do something. It's not that they necessarily fully and completely understand what's at stake when they make that decision, but at the midpoint, needs to become abundantly clear in a way that the protagonist hadn't realized that, oh crap, this is a lot bigger of an issue than I got myself into knowingly. This turning point, this turning point takes place at the center of the film. That will lead us to the turning point four, which is plot point two. It is, let's say, it's 3/4 of the way into the story, sometimes a tiny bit later. Um, if the film is a tragedy, turning point four is the high point of hope, where you think it may work out. It's, Romeo and Juliet come up with a plan with the priest to, escape and be together and figure it all out. But in most films, uh, which do have a more satisfying ending than utter tragedy, this is and should be the worst of all things that could happen for your protagonist. It is a major setback that hits 3/4 of the way into the script. It looks like the protagonist has or will undoubtedly fail. Look at this as the outlook is very bleak at this moment as the protagonist plummets now back into the new ordinary world of, this is the situation they've gotten themselves into. A lot of times at turning point two, a mentor dies, like Obi-Wan Kenobi, or or Professor Dumbledore in the Harry Potter movies. But that sent us into reeling into Act Three, because this moment, coming out of this moment, like the phoenix from the ashes, out of that turning point four, that is what makes your protagonist into a hero. Now, they're not a hero necessarily the whole movie. They're bold. They make decisions that are interesting to watch. That's a great character. But that doesn't mean they're truly heroic. What makes people truly heroic is when they've lost everything, and if they have a chance, they may or may not have a chance to crawl away. They should have a chance. Everything should be a decision, and that's what makes great characters, is a protagonist constantly making difficult decisions. And when they decide at this moment, when they've lost everything or stand to lose everything, not to crawl away and hide and not to escape, but to face something that's unfathomably bigger and darker and scarier than they had ever intended to ever stand up to at the beginning of the story, and never knew what it would cost, but it already has. Now you've written yourself flying into the end of your film, which is Act 3. Turning point 5 is the Phoenix moment where the protagonist becomes the hero, rises out of his or her own ashes, and confronts the antagonist in a final showdown for all the proverbial marbles of the story. The thing that happened during Turning Point 1 that big action that was taken, that at turning point 2, have all led to this inevitable moment of confrontation. Turning point 5 is the climax and the ultimate showdown, and it must be the biggest moment of your film. And it runs from the last 15% of your script to the last 5% of your script, roughly. It is a big moment. You have to take a moment with it. It shouldn't, fly by like that, because we've all been building, the story has all been building to this moment. So you really want to give it a moment. You want to experience the moment. You want to relish in you don't want to overwrite it. You don't want it to be boring and give too much detail, but you want the moment to have enough excitement and enough things happening emotionally, mentally, physically, enough of it that it reaches the high point of danger, the high point of interest, and it makes that journey up into this point worth it, to see this character do this thing, which is usually him making a final stand to change who he is or she is in order to arc at the end of the story. Stage 6 is the denouement. So after the climax and the dust has settled and the good guys either won or lost, you have to set up the new normal. This is the last 5% of the script only. Once you get out of the climax, the movie is relatively over, and it's just denouements aren't even necessary in some stories, but it's just hard to drop somebody at the end of a climax, something happens, and then boom, the credits start rolling. It's nice to, after you make their blood race, you just gently set them back in their seats in their movie theater, and you say, I really hope you enjoyed your journey. This is the satisfying ending to the story that was told, and sometimes a satisfying ending is not a happy ending. In Romeo and Juliet, again, if you're talking about a tragedy, the two families learn they can't war with each other anymore, and their death spawns an age of peace between families that have been warring for generations. So the denouement is the new normal. How the journey has changed the characters and the reality in which they live. That's what happens in the denouement. That's what you show. Now, these escalating structural turning points should read true to the genre at all times, honest to the characters, honest to the premise, honest to the theme, and honest to the story you set out to tell. They need to be satisfying, and then, obviously, they need to not be boring. Well, when someone wants to see your basic structure, that's what you're going to show them. It's this basic layout of these turning points that show that you know how to track the middle, and end a story all by yourselves of your own cognizance. If you have any questions, I'm always here. Thank you for watching, and I hope you found this helpful and insightful. Have a wonderful day.